Hello, this is Mrs. Brown, and today we're going to be talking about related conditionals. So we know our original conditional statements had a hypothesis and a conclusion, and that the hypothesis was P and the conclusion was represented by Q. Well, what happens when we start flipping things around? If we flip the conclusion and the hypothesis, see that they're in the opposite order, that's what's called the converse. So instead of if P, then Q, it's if Q, then P. If we negate both P and Q, so both the hypothesis and the conclusion, then it's going to be if not P, then not Q. That's called the inverse. And finally, the contrapositive, this would be the negation of the converse. So if not Q, which is the original conclusion, then not P. So looking at that, we have the original, which is P, if P, then Q. The converse, where we flip those, if Q, then P. The inverse, where it's if not P and not Q, so we negate the hypothesis and the conclusion. And finally, the contrapositive, if not Q, then P. Now, this all sounds kind of crazy, so let's take a look at an actual example. All right. So if my original statement is, if you draw, then you are an artist. So if you draw is the hypothesis. And then you are an artist would be your conclusion. So that's my original statement. To do the converse, I'm going to flip those two statements. So you can see if you are an artist, then you draw. So if Q, then P. I flipped it around. Okay. Now, if you draw, then you're an artist. That's a true statement, right? Okay. If you're an artist, then you draw. Does that have to be true? Well, what if somebody sculpts? Or what if somebody just, designs websites or something like that? That still can be considered art, but they don't necessarily have to draw. So flipping it made this false. Because we can find a counterexample is what we call it. So something that indicates that it can be not true. And so therefore that's going to be a false statement. All right, so inverse. So I'm going to take my original, but I'm going to negate it by putting not in both of the hypothesis and conclusion. So not P, then not Q. So if you do not draw, then you are not an artist. Okay, well, again, for the same reasons here, this is going to end up being a false statement because somebody may make pottery and do a beautiful job with it and never draw anything, but actually use a different medium. Or maybe they sculpt out of stone, or there's all kinds of things that we could do. So this is going to be a false statement. Finally, the contrapositive, not Q, so not the conclusion, not P, then not P. So we flipped it around and negated it. So if you are not an artist, then you do not draw. Okay, and this one is going to be true. Okay, so if you are not an artist at all, then you wouldn't be drawing. Okay, you can be an artist and not draw, but if you are not an artist, you do not draw. So the original and the contrapositive are what we call equivalent statements, as is the converse and the inverse, because these end up being both, if this one's true, this one's true, and if this one's false, this one's false. So they're related there. Let's look at one more example. If I can flip the paper. There we go. All right. So if I'm taking a look, here's a math example. If a shape is a square, then it is a quadrilateral. So again, my hypothesis, my P statement, is going to be if a shape is a square. My conclusion is it's going to be a quadrilateral, because the definition of a quadrilateral is it has 4 sides. A square has 4 sides, so therefore it is a quadrilateral. We would call that one true. Okay, So then if I look at the converse, I'm going to flip those two things. So if a shape is a quadrilateral, then it's a square. Well, if it has four sides, does it have to be a square? And the answer is no, because it could be a parallelogram, for instance, or a trapezoid. So that would be false. Okay, for the inverse, it's not P, then not Q. So it's my original statement, but I negated it. I put the not in, so did the opposite. So if a shape is not a square, then it is not a quadrilateral. Well, that would be false, because again, I could have a trapezoid, which looks something like this. That's definitely not a square, but it's still a quadrilateral because it has the four sides. So if a shape is not a square, then it's not a quadrilateral, is false. Okay. Okay. And then finally, the contrapositive is not Q, then not P. So I flipped it around and negated it. So the shape is not a quadrilateral, then it is not a square. So if it's not four-sided, then it can't be a square. And that is going to be true because, of course, squares have four sides. Okay. All right. I hope this helps, and have a great day.